Imagine, if you will, opening the first page of a really dense, sprawling fantasy novel. You know the kind I'm talking about, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The kind with the intricately drawn map right on the inside cover.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Usually depicts this mysterious, secluded world, like maybe an island that is completely isolated by a vast churning ocean that no ship dares to cross.
It is the classic trope. I mean, it's the lost world, the kind of place where the map literally just says, here be dragons, and the normal rules of biology just stop applying entirely.
And as you turn the pages, the author starts describing the inhabitants of this island. And it is just an absolute fever dream.
A total biological free-for-all.
Yeah, because there are dragons.
Yeah.
Massive, venomous, scaled beasts that hunt from the shadows. And there are rats, but they aren't the sewer pests we know.
Yeah.
These things are the size of golden retrievers.
Which is a horrifying mental image, by the way.
It gets worse. There are bird storks specifically, but they stand almost 6 feet tall, towering over people and capable of swallowing a human baby whole.
It sounds like a biological horror story. Or something, I don't know, something Jim Henson would have designed on a really dark day.
Totally. And then you have the elephants. But here is the weird twist. The elephants are tiny.
Right? The metro elephants.
Yeah, they're the size of ponies. And in the middle of all this madness, just navigating this landscape of monsters and miniature beasts, is a tribe of humans. But they aren't like us. They are tiny.
Very tiny.
Fully grown adults, standing just over 3 feet tall.
Hmm.
And they hunt the mini elephants, they run from the dragons, and they live in caves deep in the jungle.
Now, if you pitched that script to Hollywood today, they would tell you it was way too derivative of J.R. Tolkien. I mean, they'd say you just wrote Middle-earth.
It is Middle-earth.
Yeah.
But here is the hook for you listening at home, and here's exactly why we have this massive stack of source material on the desk today. This isn't fiction.
Not at all.
This isn't a fantasy novel. This is Earth, specifically the island of Flores in Indonesia. And those tiny humans, they were real. They were Homo floresiensis. And today we are going on a deep dive into their lost world.
And what a world it is. You know, we often think of human evolution as this single straight highway. We started as apes, we stood up, we got smarter, and we just marched in a straight line toward Homo sapiens.
Right, the classic chart where the monkey slowly stands up and becomes a guy holding a briefcase.
Exactly that one. But Homo floresiensis shows us that they are the off-ramp that literally nobody saw coming. They show us that evolution is actually a messy branching tree, and sometimes branches go off in wildly unexpected directions.
I am so ready to unpack this. I've been reading through the original source material, the 2004 Nature papers by Brown and Morwood, and frankly, the details are just mind-blowing.
They really are.
So our mission today for this deep dive is to understand exactly how this happened. How does a human species get shrunk down to the size of a toddler? How did they survive against literal dragons? And the big question, are they actually gone?
Oh man, that last one is a rabbit hole all on its own. But I think we need to start by grounding everyone in the timeline first, because I think this is the part of the source text that shocks people the most.
Yeah, the timeline really threw me.
Right, because when you hear prehistoric human or new species, what is your gut reaction regarding time? When do you think this happened?
My gut immediately says, dusty bones. Millions of years ago. Like maybe walking with dinosaurs, or at the very least, the extremely early Ice Age.
Right, but Homo floresiensis appeared on the scene around 190,000 years ago, which is fairly recent in geological terms.
Very recent.
But here is the real kicker. They only went extinct, supposedly anyway, around 50,000 years ago.
50,000.
Yes. To put that in perspective for you, that is well into the last ice age. That is a time when Neanderthals were already roaming Europe and constructing complex tools.
Wow.
That is a time when modern Homo sapiens, meaning us, our direct ancestors, were already spreading out of Africa and moving across the globe.
That is unnervingly close. I mean, it means that while our ancestors were out painting the caves of Lascaux or figuring out how to sew clothing together, there was this whole other version of humanity living a literal fantasy life on a tropical island a few thousand miles away.
We came very, very close to sharing the planet with them in what we would consider modern human memory. It completely dismantles that human-centric view that we are the only way to be human.
So let's rewind the clock a bit. I want to take you back to September 2003. We were on the island of Flores, Indonesia. Set the scene for us, based on the expedition logs. This wasn't some high-tech operation with ground-penetrating radar and satellites, was it?
Far from it. This was classic dirt archaeology. We're at a place called the Liang Bua Cave. It is this massive limestone cathedral of a cave. Very cool, very damp.
Okay, I can picture it.
And there is a team there, a joint expedition of Australian and Indonesian archaeologists. They were led by Mike Morwood and Raiden Soyono. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at their mission parameters in the documents, they were absolutely not looking for a new species.
They weren't.
Not at all. Their original goal was strictly to trace human migration. They wanted to understand how ancient humans moved from mainland Asia down to Australia.
Oh, so they were looking for our direct ancestors.
Exactly. They assumed the Indonesian islands were just stepping stones. They were basically looking for the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians. They expected to find modern human bones, maybe some shell middens, maybe some simple modern tools.
So they're digging in the dirt, and from what I read in the site descriptions, this was really tough digging. We're talking about 6 meters of wet clumping clay.
It was grueling work, and as they went deeper, the preservation conditions became incredibly tricky. The bones they were finding were just fragile beyond belief. The archaeologists described the consistency as wet blotting paper.
Wet blotting paper. That sounds like a nightmare to excavate.
It is. If you touch them too hard or use the wrong tool, they would just dissolve into mush. You lose the artifact completely.
That paints a really tense picture. You're 6 meters down, you're sweating in the tropical heat, and you finally hit something.
Precisely. One of the archaeologists scrapes away a bit of that wet clay and hits a skull. It gets labeled LB1, standing for Liang Bua 1.
And initially, they didn't immediately jump to, oh, we found a new species, right?
No, the first thought when they saw the size of the skull was, oh, we found a child. It was just so incredibly small. But as they carefully cleared the clay and exposed the jaw and the teeth, the confusion really set in.
Because of the teeth.
Right. The permanent teeth were fully erupted, and the wear patterns on the molars suggested a long life of chewing really tough food.
So you have a child's size, but an adult's mouth.
Exactly. They quickly realized this individual was fully grown, probably around 30 years old when she died.
A 30-year-old woman.
Yes. She was later dubbed the Little Lady of Flores, and she stood just over 1 meter tall. That is approximately 3 feet 6 inches.
Wow.
And she would have weighed maybe 30 kilograms, about 66 pounds.
That is just incredibly small. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm trying to visualize it. My nephew is 3 feet tall, and he is a literal toddler. To imagine a fully grown, weather-beaten woman of that exact stature is really difficult to process.
And this wasn't just one skeleton either. This is a hugely important detail because in archaeology, if you find one weird skeleton, you might just think, well, this is an anomaly.
Right, you might think disease or birth defect.
Exactly. But over the next 12 months, as they kept painstakingly digging in that wet clay, they found roughly 15 incomplete skeletons. They found a partially preserved skull. They found teeth, arms, feet. It was an entire population.
So it wasn't just one weird individual, it was a whole community.
It's a thriving society. And in 2004, when anthropologist Peter Brown analyzed these remains and officially named them Homo floresiensis, which just translates to man of Flores, it sent an absolute shockwave through the scientific community.
I bet.
And the nickname The Hobbit stuck almost immediately for very obvious reasons.
I mean, you really can't blame them. The name just sits too perfectly. But let's get into the nitty-gritty of what they actually looked like based on the anatomical reports, because I think the popular images just sort of shrink-rayed humans.
Right, just taking a normal person and scaling them down.
No, like take Vin Diesel and just shrink him down to 3 feet.
Yeah.
But looking at the bone structure analysis in the source material, that is not accurate at all, is it?
No, it isn't, and that is a crucial distinction to make. If you shrank a modern human down to 3 feet, they would look very different from Homo floresiensis. These beings had a highly unique mosaic anatomy. Let's start with the face.
Okay, so if I'm looking one of them in the eyes, what am I seeing?
Well, first off, you would immediately notice the lack of a chin. We modern humans have a protruding chin, right? They didn't. Their jaws sloped backward.
Okay, no chin.
And their noses were much broader and much flatter than ours. And if they smiled, well, you would see teeth that look surprisingly large for such a tiny face.
Big teeth, no chin, a flat nose. It sounds almost a bit ape-like.
It definitely leans much more toward our ancient ancestors than toward us. And the body was very robust. They weren't wispy or fragile like a human child would be. They were incredibly stocky.
Built for survival.
Exactly. Imagine a very thick, muscular build. Their leg bones were much thicker than ours relative to their overall size. But the really strange part, and this is where the evolutionary biologists got incredibly excited, is the feet.
What about their feet?
They had incredibly long, flat feet. disproportionately large for their small
Oh,
bodies.
so literally hobbit feet.
Quite literally, yes. Long, flat feet with very short toes. But the internal structure, the arch, and the way the bones connected inside the foot meant they couldn't actually walk with the same efficient stride that we have.
What do you mean?
Well, they couldn't do the heel strike toe off motion. That's the biomechanical motion that allows modern humans to run marathons and jog efficiently. They lacked that spring-like mechanism.
So how do they move around then?
They had to bend their knees much further back and actively lift their legs higher with every step. It resulted in this sort of high-stepping gait.
A high-stepping gait.
Yes, they wouldn't have been speed runners. They couldn't have outrun a modern human in a flat sprint.
Yeah.
They had to significantly lift their legs just to clear the ground.
I'm picturing them sort of picking their way through the dense jungle floor, high-stepping over roots and vines. It seems almost deliberate. What about their arms, though?
This is where the anatomy gets even more primitive. And honestly, where the whole out-of-Africa evolutionary theory starts to get really messy, their arm bones were oriented completely differently than ours.
In what way?
Their elbow joints were significantly less flexible than yours or mine. It forced them into a resting posture where they were almost constantly shrugging.
Wait, a permanent shrug.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
They had very limited rotational movement in those elbow joints. And their wrists, this is the real smoking gun in the papers, their wrist bones, specifically a little bone called the trapezoid bone,
Okay.
it looked more like the wrists of early Australopithecines or even chimpanzees than it did modern humans.
That is bizarre. Because Australopithecines lived millions of years ago in Africa. So you have this completely wild mix of features. Some look a bit human, some look like an ancient ape, and some look just completely unique to them.
Exactly. It is a biological mosaic. And then there is the brain. This was the biggest hurdle for the scientists to actually overcome. LB1, the little lady, she had a very small cranial capacity. Her brain was tiny, roughly 400 cubic centimeters. To give you a visual, that is about the size of a grapefruit.
A grapefruit. Okay, so usually in the narrative of human evolution, we associate big brains with high intelligence, right?
Sure.
We have big brains, we built cities, we went to the moon. They have grapefruit brains, so are they, not that bright.
That was definitely the initial assumption from the skeptics. The dogma in anthropology for over a century has been this concept called the encephalization quotient.
The idea that brain size relative to body size strictly dictates intelligence.
Precisely. But the evidence found inside Liangbua Cave completely contradicted that entrenched idea. Despite having a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, there was hard archaeological evidence of advanced behavior.
Like what kind of behavior?
Tool use, for one. The excavators found stone tools, and we are not just talking about river rocks they haphazardly smashed together. These were purposeful flakes, blades, and perforation tools.
So real craftsmanship.
Yes, this is what anthropologists call napping. Striking a coarse stone with a hammerstone to precisely flake off sharp edges, it requires significant foresight. You essentially have to visualize the tool hiding inside the raw rock before you even take the first strike.
And perhaps most importantly, the papers mention fire.
Concrete evidence of it, yes. They found burnt bones inside the cave. This heavily implies they were intentionally cooking food. You don't systematically control fire and cook your dinner if you are just a primitive ape.
Right.
It suggests a level of cognitive complexity that completely defies our expectations based purely on brain volume.
That is the real aha moment for me. It basically proves that you don't actually need a massive supercomputer to run complex software. Their brains were small physically, but they were incredibly efficient. They were wired strictly for survival.
Precisely. It challenges our neurocentric view that raw volume equals raw intelligence. It seems neural density, meaning how tightly packed those neurons are, might matter significantly more than just the overall size of the organ.
So we have these tiny, stocky, shrugging, high-stepping, highly intelligent tool users. The big question for me is why? How does a human species get this small in the first place? Did they just evolve and decide being small was a better strategy?
Well, evolution doesn't really decide things with intent, but natural selection acts like a very strict, very ruthless accountant. And the accountant in this specific scenario is utilizing an evolutionary principle called the island rule, sometimes known as insular dwarfism.
The island rule. It sounds like a survival reality TV show, but I know the underlying science is a bit more brutal than that.
It really is brutal. Here is the scenario laid out by the researchers. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis arrived on the island of Flores. Now, we don't know exactly who those ancestors were.
That's still a mystery.
Yes, the leading theory for a long time was that they were Homo erectus, a much larger ancient human ancestor who arrived and got shrunk down, but those primitive wrist bones we talked about earlier.
The chimpanzee-like wrists.
Right, those suggest they might have come from an even older, even smaller ancestor like Homo habilis. But regardless of who they were originally, they somehow arrived on the island.
How, though? They didn't have boats, right?
Likely not intentional boats, no. The prevailing scientific theory is a concept called rafting.
Rafting. Like natural rafts.
Yes, imagine a massive tsunami or a catastrophic storm sweeps a huge chunk of coastal land. A tangled natural raft of uprooted trees, mud, and debris out into the open ocean. A small group of these hominid ancestors happens to be clinging to it.
That sounds terrifying.
They float for days, maybe weeks, and by sheer astronomical luck, they wash up on the shores of Flores.
But once they're there, the door basically closes behind them, right?
Exactly. The ocean currents around Flores are incredibly treacherous. It's a deep water trench. They were trapped. Now imagine you are a relatively large species trapped on a finite island. An island inherently has limited physical space, but more importantly, it has severely limited calories.
Right. And big bodies are extremely expensive to maintain. If I'm 6 feet tall and weigh 200 pounds, I need a lot of cheeseburgers just to keep the lights on every day.
That's correct. It is simple metabolic math. If food resources are suddenly scarce, the biggest individuals are going to starve. They simply die before they can successfully reproduce. But the smaller individuals...
We're runs to the litter, so to speak.
Yes, the runts. They inherently require less food to survive. So they live through the famines. They are the ones who have babies. And those babies inherit the genes for a smaller stature.
And because the overall population on the island is so small, what they call the founder effect.
Exactly, the founder effect. Because the gene pool is so restricted, these small traits get reinforced and amplified really, really fast.
So over thousands of generations, the entire population physically shrinks. It is a biological survival strategy. It is not a defect. It is a highly successful adaptation. It is literally shrink or die.
Shrink or die perfectly summarizes it. And Homo floresiensis actually isn't the only example of this happening to humans. The source material mentions Homo luzonensis,
Right, found on the island of Luzon in the Philippines.
a very similar and equally fascinating case. Another dwarf human species discovered quite recently. It seems that when hominids get stuck on islands, shrinking is a fairly common evolutionary response to the environment.
And it is not just humans either, right? I noticed the source text spent some time talking about dinosaurs, which I did not expect in a paper about human ancestors.
So yes, the dinosaurs. This is honestly my absolute favorite example of the island rule in action. In Germany, paleontologists found fossils of a dinosaur called Europasaurus.
Heroposaurus, okay.
It's a long-necked sauropod closely related to the massive Brachiosaurus. Now, on the mainland continents, these types of dinosaurs were 23 meters long, truly gigantic earth-shaking animals.
Just literal walking skyscrapers with tails.
But Europasaurus lived on an isolated island environment during the Jurassic period, and over time it shrank down to just 6 meters long.
I mean, a 6-meter dinosaur is still pretty big to me sitting here today. But compared to 23 meters, that is a massive proportional reduction. That is like a normal person shrinking down to the size of a house cat.
It really is a drastic change, and we see this exact same principle in modern animals, too. On the tiny island of Nosy Hora near Madagascar, there are dwarf lemurs and dwarf chameleons. The chameleons there are so tiny they can sit comfortably on your fingernail. It is a universal rule of island nature.
But wait, the source document also heavily discussed the exact opposite phenomenon, island gigantism, which at first glance sounds totally contradictory.
It does, but it is simply the flip side of the exact same evolutionary coin. While large animals shrink to save precious calories, small animals often grow huge.
Why does a small animal get huge, though?
Usually because the island has absolutely no large predators. If you are a small bird or a field rat living on the mainland, you have to stay small so you can hide. You have to be quick to survive.
Because everything wants to eat you.
Right. But if you wash up on an island and there are no lions, no wolves, no tigers around, you can finally relax. You can afford to get big. In fact, you, evolutionary speaking, want to get big so you can fill the ecological niches left totally empty by the missing large mainland mammals.
Like the dodo bird.
A perfect example. The dodo on the island of Mauritius, it was originally just a regular pigeon that landed there, got huge, and completely forgot how to fly because literally nothing was trying to eat it. Or the giant moa birds in New Zealand, or the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands.
Okay, so this dynamic leads us perfectly into the actual ecosystem of Flores. Because while the humans were shrinking down to 3 feet tall, some of the other animals on the island were fully invoking the get huge rule.
Oh, they absolutely were.
And the resulting environment sounds absolutely terrifying. I want to spend some real time here because the environment these hobbits lived in completely defines who they were and how they survived.
It really was a lost world in every sense. Let's paint the physical picture of Flores itself first. It is an island of about 15,000 square kilometers. It is this snaking, long, rugged landmass.
Very volcanic, right?
Extremely volcanic. There's a very famous volcano there called Mount Kelamutu, which has these stunning colored crater lakes. The island is incredibly lush, highly tropical, full of deep limestone caves, sandy beaches, and vibrant coral reefs.
It sounds like a beautiful vacation paradise.
A paradise, but a paradise with very sharp teeth. Because of island gigantism, Homo floresiensis was living directly alongside some true biological monsters. First and foremost, we have to talk about the Komodo dragon.
The exact same ones that still exist there today.
The very same species, yes, but we need to really appreciate what a Komodo dragon actually is. We casually call them lizards, but that seriously diminishes how dangerous they are. They're the largest living lizards in the world. They can grow up to 3 meters long and pack 70 kilograms of pure muscle.
And if you are a 3-foot-tall human, a Komodo dragon isn't just a big lizard. To you, it is a literal dragon. It might as well be a T-Rex.
It is a reptilian beast that massively outweighs you and is just as long as you are tall, if not longer. And their hunting style is incredibly gruesome. They are classic ambush predators.
They don't chase you down.
Usually no.
Yeah.
They lie in wait, hidden in the tall brush, perfectly camouflaged. When an unsuspecting animal walks by, they just explode out of the grass with terrifying speed.
And the bite itself isn't just a quick nip, right?
No, they bite with these deeply serrated teeth, much like a great white shark's teeth. They're designed to violently rip flesh. And for a very long time, science actually thought it was just extremely nasty bacteria in their mouths that eventually killed the prey.
Oh, right. The dirty mouth theory.
Yeah. But recent physiological research shows they actually possess functional venom glands. They inject a complex venom that actively prevents blood clotting and rapidly induces massive physiological shock.
So they basically bite you once, and then they just wait for you to die.
They casually follow you and wait for the prey to bleed out or succumb to the venom shock. The source material is quite clear on this. There was certainly violent conflict between the hobbits and the dragons. The hobbits likely had to scramble up trees constantly just to escape the venom in the teeth. You can just imagine the daily psychological terror of walking through the tall grass, knowing a 3-meter dragon could be waiting anywhere.
But the dragon, amazingly, wasn't even the weirdest predator on the island. Tell me about the bird, because this is the one that really blows my mind. The scientific name was Leptoptilus robustus.
Ah, yes, the giant stork. This creature is pure, unadulterated nightmare fuel.
Describe it for the listeners.
Well, from the fossil evidence, it stood nearly 2 meters tall.
2 meters, so that, what, 6'5"?
Roughly, yes.
That is taller than me, and nearly twice the height of an adult hobbit.
Exactly. It is closely related to the modern marabou stork. Now, the modern marabou is already a fairly ugly, massive scavenging bird with a bald, fleshy head and this huge, heavy beak. But the Flores version was completely massive. Its beak would have been the size and shape of a literal spear.
And what did it eat?
Well, modern storks eat fish, frogs, or scavenge carrion. But scientists have heavily theorized that a bird of this immense size with that kind of incredible striking power would have actively hunted live terrestrial prey on the ground.
Meaning us, or well-meaning Homo floresiensis.
It is very possible, yes. The prevailing theory is that these giant storks could have easily hunted young juvenile or sick Homo floresiensis. Just picture the sheer horror of looking up and seeing a bird towering over you, looking down at you, not as a fellow animal, but as a literal snack.
That is pure horror. You climb the trees to save yourself from the dragons on the ground, but the giant storks could just pluck you right off a branch from above.
It was a very dangerous place to live. And then, of course, there were the rats.
Right, the giant rats, Papagomes armanvillae.
Yes. Rodents over 1/2 meter in length. And they actually still exist on the island of Flores today, hiding in the forests.
Huge half-meter rats.
Yeah.
But the hobbits, for all their small stature, they weren't just helpless victims in this horror story, right? They were predators themselves. They were hunters too. And their specific prey is honestly the most ironic part of this entire evolutionary story.
The stegodon. This is the strangest reversal of the natural order. Stegodon was an ancient relative and ancestor of the modern elephant, but much like the humans, it completely fell victim to the island rule. It shrank.
Pocket-sized pachyderms.
Pretty much. These dwarf elephants varied a bit in size. Some were maybe about the size of a large water buffalo, but the absolute smallest ones, the ones deep in the island's interior, were roughly the size of a modern donkey or a goat.
Wait, an elephant the size of a goat.
Some stood only as high as a human shoulder, which, remember, in the context of Flores, means only about 3 feet off the ground.
So you had these tiny humans actively hunting tiny elephants. It sounds almost cute at first, until you realize that a tiny elephant still weighs between 300 and 400 kilograms, and it still has massive tusks.
That is exactly right. It is still a very dangerous, heavy animal, and we know for a fact that the hobbits hunted them. Inside the Liangbua cave excavations, the researchers found piles of stegodon bones covered in distinct burn marks and deep butchery cut marks.
So they were actively killing these animals, systematically butchering them and cooking the meat over controlled fires.
Yes, they were.
See, this completely changes the mental image for me. It is not just these scared little people hiding in trees from dragons. It is a complex society. They were highly active participants in the food chain. Let's transition into how they actually lived day to day. Looking at the culture and daily life section. If they were hunting elephants, even mini 300-kilogram ones, how exactly did they do it? Because you can't just run up and tackle an animal that heavy.
No, you certainly can't. And you definitely can't rely on brute physical strength. LB1 was heavily muscled and strong for her diminutive size, but she couldn't physically wrestle a stegodon to the ground. They had to be exceptionally smart. This is exactly where the stone tools come into play.
Right, the stone flakes from the cave.
Yes. The oldest tools found on the island date back an astonishing 102,000 years. And the excavators didn't just find simple sharp flakes. They found distinct evidence of woodworking.
Woodworking like carving.
Exactly. Detailed microscopic residue analysis on the edges of some of these stone tools heavily suggests they were used specifically to carve and shape hardwood. This strongly implies they were manufacturing wooden spears or possibly even complex traps.
So they were actively crafting hunting weaponry.
And they very likely use highly cooperative group hunting tactics, working together as a cohesive unit. Imagine a dedicated group of 10 or maybe 12 Homo Floresiensis hunters. They track and locate a stegodon moving through the brush. They have to coordinate their movement silently to separate a weaker one from the main herd.
Using the terrain to their advantage.
Right. Maybe they carefully drive it toward a steep, muddy riverbank where its heavy legs get hopelessly stuck in the thick mud. And then once it is trapped, they use their carved wooden spears to strike at the animal's vital organs.
That requires an incredible amount of forward planning. It requires deep anticipation of the animal's behavior.
It requires what psychologists call a theory of mind. They had to deeply understand what the other hunters in their group were thinking and anticipate what the panicked stegodon was going to do next.
Which naturally brings us to the ultimate question of communication and language. Did they speak? Did they have a unique hobbit language? Could they yell to each other and say, hey, flank left, watch the tusks?
This is usually where the host asks a wonderfully imaginative question, but the expert has to step in and be the scientific buzzkill. The anatomical evidence strongly suggests probably not.
Really? No complex speech at all?
No. We can carefully look at the reconstructed base of the skull and the internal structure of the jawbone. Their vocal tracts simply likely weren't physically developed enough to produce the complex, articulate speech sounds that we utilize. They physically couldn't form the diverse vowels and sharp consonants required for a true spoken language. There is absolutely no hard anatomical evidence they could hold a verbal conversation.
So how on earth did they coordinate a complex stegodon hunt without talking?
Through deliberate sound but not structured speech. The researchers suggest it was a system of complex grunts, loud whoops, sudden screams, and specific chitters. The source text actually describes it as highly bird-like sounds.
Bird-like chittering.
Imagine a focused hunting party moving silently through the dense jungle, communicating solely with sharp whistles and rapid high-pitched chattering noises to signal movements.
That is almost creepier than them speaking. A group of tiny, muscular humans chattering and whistling like birds as they close in on an elephant with spears.
It is alien to us, but it fits their specific environment perfectly. They completely adapted to the unique pressures of their isolated world. We know they ate a varied diet of cooked stegodon meat, roasted giant rats, tough fibrous plants, which we know from their heavy tooth wear, and various tropical fruits.
They were ultimate survivors.
They lived continuously on that small island for tens of thousands of years, which is vastly longer than modern human civilization has even existed.
It is truly amazing. But as with absolutely anything this deeply groundbreaking in science, it wasn't accepted immediately by the establishment. When this discovery was first announced in 2004, the scientific community didn't just stand up and applaud. They fought bitterly. It was a massive, massive controversy,
There
right?
was a complete bloodbath in the academic journals. You have to understand, contextually, finding an entirely new human species that lives so remarkably recently is incredibly rare. And finding one that's physically weird. The inherent skepticism was sky high. The anthropological establishment simply didn't want to rewrite the evolutionary textbooks overnight.
What was the main counter-argument from the skeptics then?
The primary argument, the one that gained the most initial traction, was that LB1, the little lady, wasn't a newly discovered species at all.
Ah.
The skeptics loudly claimed she was just a regular modern Homo sapien, a standard human who unfortunately suffered from a severe genetic disease or a debilitating birth defect.
Like she was just a modern, sick human who happened to be extremely short.
Exactly. The leading and most vocal critic was Tuku Jacob, who was a very prominent Indonesian paleoanthropologist. He actually marched into the local lab, took physical possession of the delicate bones, and held onto them for months, arguing vehemently the entire time that this was just a textbook case of microcephaly.
Microcephaly, that is a medical condition where a baby's head is significantly smaller than expected, right?
Yes, it restricts brain growth, leading to severe developmental issues and lifelong cognitive impairment. Another prominent researcher, a neurologist named Jogan Weber, loudly backed this up. He argued that LB1's tiny skull perfectly fit the mathematical profile of a microcephalic modern human. He said the brain cavity size was just entirely too small to be anything evolutionary.
But that theory eventually got totally debunked by the wider community.
It became this massive, protracted battle of statistical data. But eventually, yes, it fell apart. Highly detailed 3D scanning and analysis eventually proved that the specific skull shape and the internal brain ratios cleanly fell within the normal expected range for this specific new species. It did not match the pathology of a diseased modern human, but the real absolute nail in the coffin for the entire disease theory was the other skeletons in the cave.
Right. Finding 15 different people with the exact same incredibly rare genetic condition completely isolated in one single cave seems statistically impossible.
Exactly. What are the sheer mathematical odds that an entire functioning community all shared the exact same rare birth defect? And more importantly, microcephaly fundamentally does not explain the strange wrists. It does not explain the giant flat feet.
That makes sense.
Right, because if you suffer from microcephaly, your head is small, but you don't suddenly grow ape-like Australopithecine wrist bones or entirely lose your human chin structure.
Then there was also the theory of Laurent syndrome brought up in the papers, right?
Yes. Laurent syndrome was heavily debated. It causes severe dwarfism due to a profound insensitivity to growth hormones. We actually see populations in Ecuador today that carry this specific genetic trait, but again, the specific skeletal markers simply did not match up. People with Laurent syndrome still look anatomically like scaled-down modern humans. They absolutely do not look like the unique structure of Homo floresiensis.
And what about Down syndrome? I saw that briefly mentioned.
That was proposed by a few researchers, too, along with severe iodine deficiency, which is historically called cretinism. But in every single proposed case, the physical bones just stubbornly refuse to show the specific telltale symptoms and malformations associated with those specific conditions. The scientific consensus now is extremely solid.
They are definitively a distinct human species.
Yes, a distinct branch of the human family tree.
So we have a distinct, unique species. They successfully lived there for over 100,000 years. They fought and survived literal dragons. They hunted elephants. But they aren't there anymore. What actually happened to them?
Extinction. They seemingly vanished from the fossil record around 50,000 years ago. And when anthropologists look at the data, there are essentially two main suspects in this prehistoric murder mystery.
Let me take a wild guess here. Suspect number one is us, modern humans.
Usually a very safe bet, and yes, Homo sapiens formally arrived in the wider Indonesian region around that exact same time window, roughly 50,000 years ago. We know this for a fact from various archaeological sites excavated on nearby islands.
It is always highly suspicious when the new guy suddenly shows up in the neighborhood and the longtime neighbors mysteriously disappear.
It is incredibly suspicious. Now, to be fair, we do not currently have a direct smoking gun. We haven't excavated a hobbit skeleton with a modern human spearhead lodged in its back, but we heavily know that modern humans are intensely competitive animals.
To put it mildly.
Right. We very well might have simply outhunted them for resources. We might have efficiently eaten all the remaining stegodon, completely starving the hobbits out of their own ecosystem. Or, tragically, it could have been direct violent conflict.
If you are a modern human, you're 6 feet tall, and you suddenly walk into a clearing and see these strange, chittering, 3-foot creatures. Sadly, human history strongly suggests we do not tend to play nice with things that look drastically different from us.
We historically generally do not. We likely just saw them as direct resource competitors, or perhaps even just as strange animals to be eliminated. But there's a very strong suspect number two in this mystery: the volcano.
Mount Kilimutu.
The island of Flores sits directly on the highly volatile Pacific Ring of Fire. The island is incredibly geologically active, and there is heavy geological evidence in the soil layers of a truly massive volcanic eruption occurring roughly around that same 50,000-year mark. It easily could have entirely blanketed the small island in thick, choking ash.
A complete Pompeii situation for the whole island.
Exactly. Volcanic ash completely chokes out the jungle vegetation. The large herbivores like the stegodon rapidly die off because there is simply no grass or leaves left to eat, and then the apex predators, the hobbits, the giants, storks, the dragons, they all aggressively starve in a cascading collapse.
Or maybe there's a brutal combination of both. Maybe the massive volcano severely weakened their population, wiped out their primary food sources, and then modern humans arrived shortly after and just finished the job.
That is honestly the most widely accepted and likely scenario among experts today. A devastating one-two punch of apocalyptic geology and ruthless human colonization.
But, and this is exactly where this deep dive gets really, really fun, do we actually know for a 100% absolute fact that they are completely gone? Because there is a very specific local legend on the island that heavily suggests otherwise. And honestly, reading this part of the source research genuinely gave me goosebumps.
This is hands down my absolute favorite part of the entire Flores story. It seamlessly connects the cold, hard paleontology to vibrant, living folklore in a really spine-tingling way. It heavily involves the local Nage people who live in central Flores today.
Tell us about the legend of the Ibu Gogo.
So the Nage people possess these incredibly detailed old legends that have been meticulously passed down orally for countless generations. They frequently talk about mysterious creatures living in the deep forests called the Ibu Gogo.
What exactly does that name translate to?
In the local Nage language, Ibi translates to grandmother and Gogo, roughly translates to one who eats anything.
Grandmother who eats anything. That is a genuinely terrifying name for a forest creature.
And the specific physical descriptions in the folklore are absolutely startlingly precise. The oral legends explicitly say these wild creatures were roughly about 1 meter tall. They were covered in coarse hair. They possessed broad, completely flat noses and uncomfortably large, wide mouths. They had noticeably long arms, and they were incredibly fast, agile runners.
That sounds literally exactly like the anatomical breakdown of Homo floresiensis.
It gets remarkably closer, actually. The legends firmly state that the Ibu Gogo absolutely did not speak the human Nage language. Instead, they supposedly chattered constantly in a strange, whisper-like way, or occasionally they would immediately repeat whatever was shouted at them in a strange, parrot-like fashion.
The chattering, just exactly like the high-pitched bird sounds you theorized earlier regarding their limited vocal tract.
Exactly. The behavioral and physical parallels are completely uncanny, and the local villagers have extremely specific, grounded stories about directly interacting with them. These weren't considered ethereal magic spirits or ghosts. They were treated as flesh and blood physical neighbors living right up in the hills.
And clearly they were not considered very good neighbors.
No, not at all. The old story goes that the Ibu Gogo lived in the deep limestone caves, situated very near the human villages. Specifically, caves in the Liangbua region. At first, there was a very uneasy, tense truce between the two groups. But the Ibu Gogo were considered aggressive pests. They kept sneaking down and brazenly stealing freshly grown food from the village crops. They would raid the outdoor kitchens at night. And then the legend takes a very, very dark turn. The creatures allegedly started stealing human babies.
Okay, yeah, truce immediately over.
The human villagers, quite understandably, had finally had enough. So they hatched an elaborate trap to wipe them out. They cautiously approached the cave and offered the Ibu Gogo group a supposed peace gift. They handed over vast amounts of dry palm fiber. They gestured and told the wild creatures it was strictly to make soft bedding or thick clothes to keep themselves warm during the cold nights.
An ancient Trojan horse strategy.
Exactly. Palm fiber, if you don't know, is incredibly dry and highly, highly flammable. The Ibugogo, completely not understanding the inherent danger, eagerly dragged all the fibrous material deep into the very back of their cave. Once they were all safely inside, the human villagers suddenly threw in a firebrand, a lit burning torch.
Whoa.
The fire violently caught the dry palm fiber almost instantly. Thick, black smoke and intense flames immediately filled the enclosed cave system. The legend grimly states that almost all of the Ibugogo were horribly burned alive or quickly suffocated in the toxic smoke.
That is incredibly brutal.
It is a dark story, but the oral legend crucially also explicitly says that a single pair of them, one male and one female, somehow managed to escape the flames. They supposedly ran completely terrified deep into the impenetrable forest, heading straight toward the high volcanic peaks.
Running off into the deep forest, heavily implying that they just might still be out there somewhere.
That is the lingering implication, yes. And you have to remember, Flores physically still possesses immensely dense, incredibly rugged, remote jungles that are still very, very hard to navigate or fully map, even today.
So is there any real scientific truth to this at all? Could a tiny pocket of Homo floresiensis actually still be out there surviving in the mountains?
Well, there is a respected ethnologist named Gregory Forth who published a fascinating book quite recently called Between Ape and Human. He actually spent years living directly with Nage people, and he genuinely thinks these local stories are just entirely too accurate anatomically to be mere coincidence. He controversially believes the Ibugogo were literally Homo floresiensis surviving in small numbers until very, very recently. Maybe even surviving right up until the Dutch colonists first arrived on the island in the 19th century.
But the hard scientist in you, the expert, is clearly shaking your head right now.
Look, the empirical scientist in me has to look objectively at the hard physical data. And the data says we have honestly found absolutely no physical bones or fossils younger than 50,000 years old. If they were actively stealing village crops in the 18th or 19th century, we should easily find relatively fresh bones. We should clearly find their distinct stone tools in the topmost shallow layers of the excavated soil. And frankly, we just haven't.
So if it isn't literally them surviving to the modern day, what exactly is the Ibugogo legend then?
It is most likely what anthropologists refer to as a deep cultural memory. Perhaps the very first wave of modern humans who arrived on the island roughly 50,000 years ago actually did see them in person. They very likely did fight them over territory. Maybe they literally even burned a group of them out of a specific cave. And that incredibly dramatic, traumatic story was vividly told and retold and heavily mythologized around campfires over thousands and thousands of years until it slowly morphed into the enduring legend of the Ibugogo.
Or maybe the local villagers just organically found the strange tiny skeletons in the deep caves centuries ago. They saw how bizarrely small they were. They saw the weird flat noses on the skulls, and they essentially reverse engineered a scary campfire story to explain them away. Like,
Yeah.
oh, these must be the greedy ancient ancestors who ate absolutely anything.
Also an incredibly possible and common phenomenon in folklore. But honestly, either way you look at it, it clearly shows that these unique little beings left a massive enduring mark. Even if they are entirely physically gone, they still absolutely haunt the culture of the island.
It is a really haunting thought to sit with. Just knowing for a fact that we actually shared this giant planet with something so fundamentally different from us, it really forces you to look at a global map completely differently.
It perfectly brings us right back to that opening image of the blank evolutionary canvas. Remote islands are essentially like sealed petri dishes for biological evolution. You isolate a species completely, you apply very strange, strict environmental pressures, and Mother Nature just paints something entirely new. Homo floresiensis firmly proves that we humans are not somehow magically immune to these basic biological rules. We are ultimately just animals subject to the exact same harsh natural laws as the shrinking dinosaurs and the dwarf elephants.
It constantly makes you wonder what else is secretly out there just patiently buried in the mud of some other remote island. Like what about Sulawesi? Or the deeper islands of the Philippines? What other totally wild biological experiments did nature quietly run while we weren't looking?
Or honestly, what was already completely lost before we even had the chance to find it. The global ocean levels have risen significantly since the end of the last ice age. There honestly could be entire undiscovered evolutionary branches, entire unknown hominid species completely drowned and buried deep on the submerged continental shelves.
You know, the source material briefly mentions that when they first discovered the tiny bones, The lead discoverers heavily joked and almost officially named the new species Homo habitus.
He really truly did. Mike Moore would practically beg to formally call it that. But the academic scientific naming conventions are notoriously strict and deeply humorless. Homo floresiensis admittedly sounds a bit more dignified for the textbooks.
Maybe it does, but they will absolutely always be hobbits to me. And honestly, reading this deep dive, the pure historical reality is vastly cooler than the fiction book. Tolkien wrote lovingly about hobbits living in cozy little holes in the ground, happily eating second breakfast and intensely worrying about a misplaced pocket handkerchief. But the real, actual hobbits of Flores, they were violently fighting 3-meter dragons. They were actively hunting elephants with hand-carved spears, and they were surviving apocalyptic volcanic eruptions. They were absolute badasses.
And that right there is the pure, unadulterated beauty of rigorous science. Reality so often completely exceeds the limits of our own fictional imagination.
So here's a final provocative thought for you listening at home today. The next time you sit down to watch a sprawling high fantasy movie, or you read a dense book about dwarves and ancient elves and dark forest monsters, just try to remember, a very real biological version of that exact fantasy world actually existed. Not on some distant alien planet, not in some magical alternate dimension, but right here on Earth, in Indonesia.
Just a fleeting geological moment ago.
And if you happen to have a spare moment today, seriously go online and specifically look up the forensic facial reconstructions of the little lady of Flores. Look deeply at her rendered face. It is a face that is hauntingly, undeniably human and yet just utterly, utterly different from anything you see in the mirror. It is quite literally a window into a strange, forgotten past that we only just barely missed.
Absolutely do that. Go look her up right now. I promise it will be absolute chill. Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive deep dive into the wildly fascinating lost world of Flores. Stay curious out there.
And always keep asking questions.